Danyna was a straight-A student, someone who many others looked up to. She dreamt of one day working in computer engineering or robotics and was doing everything in her power to make that happen.
I didn't want to get hurt. I didn't know.
Friendship is supposed to be sacred. But what happens when one friend discovers a betrayal and speaks the truth for 16-year-old Danyna Gibson? Telling the truth cost her everything. In a classroom at Cass Technical High School, her best friend, Tanaya Lewis, pulled a knife and stabbed her in front of nearly 30 witnesses. The betrayal was real. Tanaya had been with Danyna's boyfriend. Danyna confronted her, and Tanaya decided the truth was worth killing for. A 17-year-old, now facing decades in prison for a murder that started with jealousy and ended in blood. This is the story of how friendship, jealousy, and truth collided in a Michigan high school. September 12, 2018 began like any other Wednesday for 16-year-old Danyna Gibson, but it would be her last. She walked through the doors of her Michigan high school with a backpack over her shoulder and a future mapped out in her mind. Straight-A student, dreams of computer engineering, robotics, building things that mattered. The kind of girl her classmates looked up to, the kind doing everything in her power to make something of herself. The hallways were familiar. The faces were familiar. The morning light streaming through the windows of the tech building looked exactly like it had every other Wednesday. She greeted classmates, exchanged smiles, moved through the routine of an ordinary school day. Everything felt safe. Everything felt normal. There was no warning. Second period was web design, taught by Miss Sonnenfeld in the tech building classroom. Nearly 30 students filled the room, settling into their seats with the usual sounds of backpacks dropping, chairs scraping, voices overlapping in the last moments before the bell. Danyna took her usual seat. She opened her notebook. Ready to learn. Ready to add another day to the careful construction of her future. She had no way of knowing this morning would be different from all the others, that dreams of robotics labs and engineering degrees would never leave the planning stage. That, the classroom she trusted, the space that was supposed to be safe, would become the site of her murder. The morning moved forward. Students talked. Ms. Sonnenfeld prepared for the lesson. The clock on the wall counted down seconds Danyna didn't know were running out. Outside the windows, the September sky stretched clear and blue. Inside, the air felt ordinary, unremarkable, carrying no hint of what was about to shatter. Danyna was 16 years old. She was building a life. She was doing everything right. And someone else in that room had made a plan for this day. The bell rang for second period to begin. She settled into her seat, notebook open, pen ready. By the time this period ended, she would be unconscious and dying on the classroom floor, surrounded by classmates who would never forget what they witnessed. The straight-A student with dreams of engineering would never graduate, never turn 17, never step foot in a college classroom or a robotics lab. She had less than 20 minutes left to live. Keep that timeline in mind. Less than 20 minutes from the moment the bell rang to the moment Danyna's life was taken from her. In a classroom, surrounded by witnesses, in a place that was supposed to be safe. But safety is an illusion when someone walks in with murder already decided. Danyna wasn't the only one walking into that classroom with a plan for the day. And the other plan, the one that had been forming in someone else's mind, was already in motion. That someone else was Tanaya Lewis. She walked through the classroom door and extended her hand to Ms. Sonnenfeld, the same ritual greeting she performed every day, as if this Wednesday were no different from any other. Tanaya Lewis, 17 years old and a straight-A student herself, had once been Danyna's best friend, before obsessive jealousy over an ex-boyfriend turned her into something else entirely. The handshake was automatic. practiced, normal on the surface, but underneath, something was different. The air in the classroom felt thick to her, hard to breathe, her vision already starting to blur at the edges. She moved to her desk and sat down, across the row of seats. Danyna's desk was empty, not there yet. The space where her former best friend usually sat was vacant, waiting. Tanaya looked at that empty desk and knew what was coming. She had given away $100 that morning. Money she knew somehow she wouldn't need after today. Think about that for a moment. A 17-year-old girl walks into school and gives away $100, not lending it, giving it away, because she knows she won't need money anymore. That's not impulse. That's certainty. Students filtered into the classroom, backpacks dropping, voices overlapping in the ordinary chaos before the bell. Tanaya sat at her desk, watching the door. The classroom filled around her, nearly 30 students settling into their seats, pulling out notebooks, preparing for another day of instruction. The morning light streamed through the windows. Everything looked normal. There are mornings when someone walks into a room carrying a decision they can't take back, and no one else can see it coming. The door opened again. Danyna Gibson walked in with her backpack over her shoulder. Her plans for computer engineering still intact, her future still mapped out in her mind. She crossed the classroom floor, moving between the rows of desks, heading for her usual seat. She had no way of knowing the girl 3 seats over had brought a small black kitchen knife to school that morning. No way of knowing her former best friend had already decided how this day would end. Danyna set her backpack down and took her seat. Opened her notebook, glanced up briefly at the classroom around her. 30 students, 1 teacher, 1 ordinary Wednesday morning in September. The same scene as every other day. But it wasn't the same. Not even close. 3 seats over. Tanaya sat with the weight of premeditation pressing down on her chest. She had shaken the teacher's hand. She had given away money she knew she wouldn't need. She had walked into this classroom carrying a knife and a plan. Danyna settled into her desk, ready to learn, ready to add another day to the careful construction of her future. She had no idea the girl 3 seats over had brought a knife. No idea that jealousy had curdled into something lethal. No idea that within minutes she would be bleeding on the classroom floor while 30 students watched in frozen horror. The bell rang for second period to begin. The attack would come without warning. In front of everyone. It happened in the middle of second period. Tanaya Lewis rose from her desk in one sudden motion and drove the small black kitchen knife into Danyna Gibson's back. No warning. No words. One moment the classroom was ordinary students at their desks, Ms. Sonnenfeld beginning the lesson, and the next moment violence erupted in a space that was supposed to be safe. Danyna tried to stand, tried to turn, tried to understand what was happening to her, but Tanaya didn't stop. She raised the knife again and again. Danyna stumbled toward the door, desperate to escape, and Tanaya chased her. 30 students watched it happen in real time, frozen, screaming, unable to process what they were seeing. Keep that number in mind. 30 witnesses. 30 teenagers who came to school that morning expecting an ordinary Wednesday and instead watched their classmate being murdered. Danyna reached for the doorway, her body moving on pure survival instinct. Tanaya followed, the knife rising and falling, blood spread across the floor. Students scrambled away from their desks, bodies hitting furniture, voices overlapping in panic and horror. And then the witnesses noticed something that made the scene even worse. Tanaya Lewis was laughing, not crying, not screaming in rage or panic. Laughing. Her face showed something witnesses would later struggle to describe, not anger, Not fear, but something closer to joy. As if this was exactly what she wanted. As if watching Danyna Gibson bleed and stumble and try desperately to run was giving her pleasure. That's not passion. That's not a moment of uncontrolled emotion. That's something else entirely. Ms. Sonnenfeld moved. She grabbed Tanaya and shoved her bodily into the hallway, forcing the attacker away from the victim. Students poured out of the classroom, fleeing into the corridor, their screams echoing through the tech building. 30 teenagers learning in one terrible instant that safety is an illusion, that violence doesn't announce itself, that someone you sit beside in class can become a killer without warning. Danyna Gibson collapsed against a desk. Her hand pressed to her back where the knife had gone in. The classroom floor was slick with blood. Her notebook lay open on her desk, pen still resting in the margin. Notes from just minutes earlier when her future was still intact. Miss Sonnenfeld had separated them. Tanaya shoved into the hallway, the knife finally out of her hand. But for Danyna, the separation came too late. The wounds were already there. The blood was already spreading. She was 16 years old, and she was dying. Students scattered through the hallways. Voices screamed for help. Someone was already calling 911. But the damage had been done in seconds. And seconds don't reverse. The school resource officer would reach her in under a minute. But a minute can be a lifetime when you're bleeding out on a classroom floor. He reached her in seconds. The school resource officer, trained in emergency response, dropped to his knees beside Danyna Gibson in the hallway and pressed his hands into the wounds. Multiple wounds. Too many. Blood soaked through his fingers as he applied pressure, trying to slow what his training told him was already catastrophic bleeding. "Stay with me," he said. "Look at me. Help is coming." Danyna's eyes flickered toward him, unfocused. Students were still fleeing past them into the corridor, their screams echoing off the walls. The officer kept his hands pressed firm against her back, trying to compress wounds that kept bleeding through his fingers. He was doing everything right. But sometimes everything right isn't enough. All around him, students were on their phones calling 911, a flood of panicked voices, all reporting the same nightmare. Multiple 911 dispatchers received simultaneous calls from the school, each voice more panicked than the last, all describing the same horror. "Someone stabbed her. There's so much blood. We need an ambulance right now." The calls overlapped. Urgent and terrified, dispatchers tried to get details, location. Injuries. How many victims? But the answers kept circling back to the same terrible fact. A girl, a classroom, a knife. Blood everywhere. The officer kept working, checking airways, monitoring consciousness, applying pressure to wounds that wouldn't stop bleeding. His hands were soaked red. Danyna's breathing was shallow, irregular. Her eyes were losing focus, slipping away from the hallway, from the officer's face, from consciousness itself. In the distance, the ambulance siren grew louder. There's a particular kind of helplessness in doing everything right and watching it not be enough, hands applying perfect pressure to wounds that won't stop bleeding. Words of comfort spoken to someone already slipping away. The officer had been trained for this. Emergency response, trauma stabilization, keep the patient conscious, keep them breathing, buy time until the paramedics arrive. He was buying time Danyna Gibson didn't have. The paramedics arrived within minutes and took over, working with professional urgency on a patient already slipping away. They moved fast. Assessment, stabilization, preparing to transport. The officer stepped back, giving them room, his hands still covered in her blood. They loaded her onto the stretcher, lifted her into the ambulance, the doors slammed shut, the siren wailed. Within minutes, Danyna Gibson would be at the hospital, surrounded by doctors and equipment and every resource modern medicine could offer. But she would never speak again. The officer stood in the hallway, watching the ambulance pull away. His hands were covered in blood. His training had taught him how to respond to trauma, how to stabilize a victim, how to do everything right. It hadn't taught him how to watch a 16-year-old girl die in front of him and know there was nothing more he could have done somewhere else. A family still didn't know their daughter wasn't coming home. Danyna's mother received the call in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. There had been an incident at the school. Your daughter has been taken to the hospital. The voice on the other end was professional, careful, trained to give information without giving too much. No details about what had happened. No explanation of how bad it was, just the essential facts. There's been an incident. Your daughter is being transported to the hospital. You should come right away. Those are the words that split a parent's life into before and after. She hung up the phone and grabbed her keys. An incident. What did that mean? A fall, an accident in gym class, something serious enough to call, serious enough to say come right away, but how serious? She didn't know yet that her daughter had been stabbed. Didn't know about the knife, the blood, the 30 witnesses, didn't know that Danyna would never wake up. She only knew hospital. Now, the drive felt endless. Every red light stretched out like punishment. Every mile took hours. That terrible space between not knowing and finding out, the mind racing through possibilities, each one worse than the last. Is she hurt? How badly? Will she be okay? There's a specific kind of terror in the drive to a hospital when you don't yet know what you're driving toward, when you're suspended between two versions of your life, the before and the after. And you can feel the distance closing, but you can't see which side you'll land on. The hospital entrance came into view. She parked, rushed inside, found someone who could tell her where her daughter was. The fluorescent lights were too bright. The air was cold. Voices urgent but controlled. The hospital staff delivered information in careful, measured tones, trained to give news without giving too much, to prepare families for the worst without saying it outright. She's alive. 2 words. The first piece of information. Danyna was alive. She's in critical condition. The doctors are working on her now. Alive. That was what mattered. That was the anchor to hold on to. She's alive. The doctors are working. There's still a chance. Hope lived in those words. Thin and fragile, but real. Critical condition meant serious, meant bad, but alive meant there was still something to fight for. It would be hours before the family understood that was the last good news they would receive. Danyna Gibson was alive when her mother reached the hospital. The doctors were working, the machines were running, there was still a heartbeat. For a few more hours, for a few more days, there would still be hope. But the worst was already done. The knife had already gone in. The damage was already catastrophic. The waiting would last for days. Hope stretching thinner and thinner before it finally broke. The days at the hospital stretched out like a held breath, each morning bringing the same question, each night leaving it unanswered. Danyna's mother kept vigil in the ICU, watching the machines breathe for her daughter. The doctors gave updates, stable, critical, no change. The rhythm of monitors beeping became the soundtrack to waiting. Hope lived in those beeps, in the rise and fall of Danyna's chest powered by machines, in the possibility that tomorrow might bring different news. No change today. We're doing everything we can. It's a waiting game now. The words became familiar. The waiting became everything. And with each day that passed, hope stretched thinner, more transparent, harder to hold on to. But it didn't break. Not until it had to. After several days, the machines that had been breathing for Danyna Gibson went quiet. She died from her injuries. The knife wounds were too severe, the damage too catastrophic. Modern medicine had bought time, days instead of minutes, but it couldn't reverse what had been done in that classroom. The monitors that had beeped steadily for days went silent. The machines stopped their rhythm. "I'm so sorry. She's gone." There was nothing more we could do. Danyna Gibson was 16 years old. She had dreamed of robotics labs and computer engineering degrees. She had walked into second period on a Wednesday morning with plans for a future that would never arrive. And now she was gone. There's a particular cruelty in hope that stretches over days instead of ending in an instant, each sunrise bringing the possibility that today might be different. Each sunset confirming it isn't. Until finally the hope that sustained you becomes the thing that makes the ending unbearable. The family began the impossible work of grief, planning a funeral for a daughter who should have been planning college applications, choosing burial clothes for a girl who should have been choosing her senior year classes, making arrangements no parent should ever have to make. Danyna Gibson was dead, and while her family sat in that hospital room beginning to comprehend the permanence of loss, Tanaya Lewis was sitting in an interrogation room, talking to police. The investigation hadn't waited for grief. It had begun the moment the knife went in. Evidence collected at the school, witnesses interviewed, the attacker taken into custody. And now, while Danyna's mother tried to understand how to live in a world where her daughter no longer existed, the detective sat across from the girl who had made that world real. Tanaya Lewis, 17 years old, straight-A student, the one who had walked into that classroom with a plan. She was ready to talk. Danyna Gibson was gone. Her dreams would never leave the planning stage, and the investigation into why she died had already begun. The interrogation room would become the place where the truth finally surfaced. Inside the interrogation room, Tanaya Lewis sat across from the detective, the camera mounted on the wall between them recording every word. She wasn't crying. She wasn't shaking. Hours earlier, she had stabbed her classmate to death in front of 30 witnesses. Now she sat in a police interrogation room. And her first question wasn't about Danyna, or about what would happen to her, or whether she could call her parents. "How come there's no cameras in here?" The detective looked at her. Then he pointed above her head. "The camera in this room is that device above you there." Tanaya's eyes followed his gesture to the small device mounted on the wall. She nodded, calculating, aware of what was being recorded, where she was being watched from, how the room was arranged. Her concern wasn't whether cameras existed, it was where they were positioned. "It's all being recorded." She nodded again. "Good to know. Think about that for a moment. She's 17 years old. She's just killed someone, and her first priority is mapping the surveillance. Most 17-year-olds pulled from a crime scene would be crying, panicking, asking for their parents, but Tanaya Lewis sat perfectly still, asking technical questions about surveillance equipment like she was planning her performance for the camera she knew was watching. The detective began building rapport, explained his job was to find the truth, to gather all the information about what had happened that day. He kept his voice measured, calm. Standard interrogation procedure: make the suspect feel comfortable, create an environment where they'll talk. Tanaya listened. She watched. She waited. She was performing calm, a teenager, trying to control a room she had no control over, maintaining composure where most would shatter. No tears, no visible panic. Just a 17-year-old girl who had walked into a classroom with a knife and was now sitting across from a detective with her shoulders straight and her voice steady. The detective asked if she was interested in telling her side of the story. "I don't have anything to hide." 5 words. Delivered with confidence, with openness, as if she was being helpful, cooperative, transparent, as if having nothing to hide was the same thing as telling the truth. "I'm just going to ask you questions," the detective said. She nodded. She was ready to talk, ready to tell her side. The camera above them recorded her expression, controlled, calculated, showing none of the horror or remorse you'd expect from someone who had just taken a life. Tanaya Lewis said she had nothing to hide, that she was ready to tell her side of the story. The detective leaned back, ready to listen. Everything she was about to say would be carefully constructed, strategically delivered, and almost none of it would be the whole truth. But first, she needed to talk to someone else. The detective slid the Miranda rights form across the table and began reading. "You have the right to remain silent." Tanaya listened, her eyes on the form. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. Do you understand these rights?" She nodded. Verbally confirmed yes, she understood. The detective slid the form forward for her signature. She stopped. Not a refusal, a pause. A moment of calculation. Then she spoke, and what came out of her mouth didn't sound like a 17-year-old in shock. "Because everything up until this moment didn't matter because no one read me my rights." The detective waited. "And now that I've been read my rights, anything I say or do can be used against me." She wasn't asking. She was explaining, parsing the legal implications with precision, pre-Miranda statements versus post-Miranda evidence. The difference between what could be used in court and what couldn't. She understood exactly what signing that form would mean. "I know what this means." Most 17-year-olds can barely explain what Miranda rights mean. Tanaya Lewis recited the legal implications like she'd studied case law, parsing the difference between admissible and inadmissible evidence with the precision of someone who'd been planning for this moment. The detective asked if she wanted to sign. She didn't pick up the pen. Instead, she made a request. "I can't sign that until I talk to him." Not a lawyer, not her parents. Him. Evan. Her ex-boyfriend, the boy who had broken up with her 2 months earlier, the boy whose name had been at the center of the jealousy that turned lethal. The reason Danyna Gibson was dead. I need to hear his voice. Think about that. She's sitting in an interrogation room. She's just stabbed her classmate to death. She knows her words are about to become evidence. And her priority isn't legal protection, it's hearing from the boy who'd rejected her. The detective agreed. Standard procedure when a suspect makes a specific request before waiving Miranda. He would arrange the call. "Just give me 20 minutes. 20 minutes to talk to Evan. 20 minutes before she would sign anything. Before she would formally agree to questioning. Before the interrogation could officially begin. She needed his voice first. The detective stepped out, leaving Tanaya alone in the interrogation room. The camera above her kept recording. She sat perfectly still, hands folded on the table, waiting for the phone to ring. No tears, no panic, just waiting. She had just killed someone. And the person she needed most wasn't a lawyer to protect her rights or a parent to comfort her. It was the boy who'd broken up with her. The boy whose relationship with Danyna had triggered everything. The boy she couldn't let go. 20 minutes alone with her thoughts. 20 minutes before the phone would ring and she would hear Evan's voice for the first time since the stabbing. 20 minutes before the detective would understand exactly how deep her obsession ran. What she would say to him would reveal everything about why Danyna had to die. When the phone rang, Tanaya's calculated composure shattered. She grabbed it, and her voice broke into sobs the moment she heard Evan on the other end. Gone was the girl who'd asked about camera placement and parsed Miranda rights like case law. In her place was someone raw, desperate, barely coherent. I'm sorry, baby. I'm sorry. I love you." The detective listened. Tanaya's transformation was total. The control she'd maintained since walking into the interrogation room dissolved the instant she heard her ex-boyfriend's voice. Did you love her? Did you have feelings for her? There it was, the question that revealed everything. Not, did you kill someone? Not, what have I done? Did you love her? Danyna Gibson was dead. And Tanaya's first concern, her only real concern, was whether Evan had loved her. Please just tell me the truth. The obsession was audible, raw, desperate. A girl who'd committed murder, still fixated on the boy who'd broken up with her, still needing to know if he'd felt something for the victim, still unable to let go. The call ended. Tanaya signed the Miranda waiver without hesitation. She was ready to talk now, ready to tell her story. He was the love of my life. She spoke about Evan with broken-hearted intensity, about how much she'd loved him, about how Danyna had gotten in the way. I don't like her. I hate her. Pure venom, the kind of jealousy that burns hot and doesn't fade. Tanaya painted herself as the wronged girlfriend, betrayed, heartbroken, driven to the edge by a romantic rival. She was trying to take him from me. Teenage love triangles are easy to understand. Everyone remembers the intensity of first heartbreak, the way jealousy can consume you. So when a 17-year-old girl sobs about losing the boy she loves to another girl, it feels like the whole story, like you've heard enough to know exactly what happened and why. The detective listened, took notes, nodded. He'd heard this story before. Teenage love triangle, jealousy spiraling into rage. Girl loses boyfriend to another girl, can't handle it, snaps. It was textbook, tragic, but comprehensible. Tanaya seemed heartbroken. Seemed like a girl who'd loved someone too much and lost control when she couldn't have him. The tears were real. The emotion was genuine. The motive was crystal clear. Love, jealousy, revenge. It all fit. A story as old as high school itself, simple, sad, and complete. The detective had a narrative that made sense. Jealous ex-girlfriend kills romantic rival. Danyna Gibson had tried to take Evan from Tanaya, and Tanaya had made sure she never could. Case closed. Except it wasn't. The detective thought he understood Tanaya loved Evan. Danyna got in the way. Jealousy turned to rage. It was a story that felt true because it was familiar, because everyone had seen versions of it before, because it explained everything in terms that made emotional sense. But the story Tanaya was telling wasn't the truth. It was the exact opposite of the truth. And the detective was about to discover that everything was backwards. The detective had one more question, the kind that seemed small but would crack the entire story open. So why was Danyna angry with you? Tanaya paused. The question hung in the air between them. If Danyna had been trying to steal Evan, if she'd been the romantic rival, why had she been the one who was angry? The detective waited. What exactly did Danyna do? Tanaya's answer started to shift. The clean narrative she'd sold, jealous girl takes boyfriend, wronged girlfriend snaps, began to fracture. You said she was trying to take him from you. How? The detective kept probing. Walk me through what happened. Why did the friendship end? What did Danyna say? What did she tell Evan? And then it emerged. She found out what I did. Not what Danyna did. What Tanaya did. She told him I was cheating. There it was. the inversion. Tanaya Lewis hadn't been the victim of romantic betrayal. She had been the betrayer. She had cheated on Evan. And Danyna Gibson, her best friend. The girl with dreams of robotics and computer engineering had found out. She said it wasn't fair to him, that he deserved to know. Danyna had told Evan the truth. Not to steal him, not to get in the way, because it was the right thing to do. Because Evan deserved to know his girlfriend had been unfaithful. The detective leaned back in his chair, processing everything Tanaya had said earlier. All the tears about losing Evan, all the rage about Danyna taking him away had to be reread now. The jealousy wasn't about losing a boyfriend to a rival. It was about being exposed, about guilt caught in daylight. Guilt is a shapeshifter. It projects itself outward, transforms betrayal into paranoia, makes the betrayer convinced everyone else is betraying them. Because if you're capable of lying, you assume everyone around you must be lying too. The obsessive surveillance of Evan's phone, the deleted contacts, the constant accusations, all of it was Tanaya's guilt manifesting as suspicion. She had been the one cheating. So she became convinced Evan must be cheating too. And when Danyna told him the truth about what Tanaya had done, Tanaya reframed it as betrayal. Danyna hadn't stolen Evan. She had exposed Tanaya. And for that act of honesty, for being a good friend to someone who needed to know the truth, Danyna Gibson was stabbed to death in front of 30 witnesses. The detective looked at Tanaya across the table. The girl who'd sobbed about losing the love of her life, the girl who'd painted herself as heartbroken and wronged. She hadn't been driven to murder by romantic loss. She'd been driven by rage at being caught. Danyna Gibson hadn't stolen anything from Tanaya Lewis. She had discovered Tanaya's infidelity and told Evan the truth because she thought it was the right thing to do. For that act of honesty, for trying to help a friend, she murdered. The whole story was backwards, and there was more the detective needed to understand about that final night. The detective leaned forward. What happened the night before? What did Danyna say to you? Tanaya described the text exchange from September 11th, the night before the murder. Danyna had confronted her through messages, told her to stop, warned her. She said to stop talking to her. Danyna had drawn a boundary. A final attempt to end the harassment, to get Tanaya to leave Evan alone, to stop the obsessive contact. She said I was going to get myself in more trouble. A warning, not a threat. A friend trying to pull someone back from the edge. Danyna could see where this was heading, the obsession spiraling, Tanaya unable to accept that Evan had moved on. She tried to intervene. She told me to leave him alone. The message was clear, direct. Stop contacting Evan. Move forward. Let it end. Danyna was trying to protect both of them. Evan from harassment, Tanaya from her own worst impulses. Tanaya sat across from the detective, recounting this with a flatness that didn't match the content. Before we reveal what Tanaya said about that rage, are you still here? Comment A if you think she planned it that night, or B if you think it was morning impulse, and add one short reason in 5 to 10 words. Note what follows includes recreated dialogue for narrative depth. The detective asked how she'd responded to Danyna's warning. I was so angry, I just blocked her. Blocking a phone number. A normal teenage response to conflict. Cut off contact. Avoid the confrontation. Move on. Except Tanaya hadn't moved on. She made me so angry. The detective waited for more. Listened to the quality of Tanaya's voice as she described that anger. Something about it didn't sound like typical teenage rage, hot and loud and quick to burn out. So angry. I couldn't feel anything. There it was. Not hot anger, Not tears or shouting or breaking things. Anger so deep it went past feeling. Anger that became something colder, emptier, more deliberate. There's a kind of anger that burns hot and fades fast. The kind teenagers feel and forget within hours. But there's another kind that goes so deep it stops feeling like anger at all, because something colder and more deliberate. The kind that makes decisions in the dark and wakes up ready to execute them. The detective processed what he was hearing. Blocking Danyna's number was the action Tanaya described. But that wasn't where the story ended. She hadn't just blocked the number and cried herself to sleep. She had blocked the number and made a different kind of decision. The kind that led to a knife in a kitchen drawer. The kind that led to a morning walk to school with premeditation in every step. The kind that led to a classroom attack in front of 30 witnesses. Tanaya Lewis had blocked Danyna Gibson's number that night, sitting alone with her phone and her rage. But blocking the number wasn't the end of the conversation. It was the moment she stopped arguing and started planning. By morning, she would have a knife. The detective needed to understand that morning how planning became action. The detective's voice softened, almost friendly. "Tell me about your morning. What time did you wake up?" The shift in tone was deliberate. No more questions about rage or motives or what Danyna had done, just simple, gentle questions about routine. The kind of questions that feel safe. What kind of dog do you have? Tanaya relaxed slightly. Talking about her dog felt harmless. She described taking him out at 5 in the morning, watching him in the backyard while the sun came up. "Does he go to the bathroom pretty quick?" The detective nodded. Building rapport, making her comfortable. Every mundane detail she gave was another piece of the timeline he was constructing. Not just what happened, but when, in what order, with what state of mind. "Did you have anything for breakfast?" No breakfast at home that morning. Tanaya described her routine, checking the weather, choosing what to wear, getting ready for school like any other Wednesday. "What were you going to wear?" "Just a normal morning." She nodded. Normal. Routine. The detective kept his voice casual, kept the questions light, but every answer pulled her closer to the moment she hadn't admitted yet. Good interrogators know that people lower their guard when you ask about dogs and breakfast. That mundane questions feel safe and easy to answer. But every detail you give is another thread they can pull. Another step on the path to the one question you don't want to answer. The detective asked about music. "What were you listening to?" Tanaya described a song she'd been playing that morning. One song, over and over. Just that one song, over and over. Yes, on repeat, the same track playing while she got ready, while she prepared to walk out the door. What's the song about? Being pushed to the edge. All her friends dead. The kind of lyrics that matched the rage she described the night before, the anger so deep it stopped feeling like anger. The detective nodded. Still gentle, still sympathetic, as if she'd just told him about the weather or what she'd had for lunch. But the trap was tightening. Each question seemed innocent on its own. Together they were building a picture. Wake up at 5, walk the dog, no breakfast, choose clothes, listen to a song about being pushed to the edge over and over while getting ready for school. A normal morning. Except it wasn't. The detective had walked Tanaya through her entire morning waking up, walking the dog, choosing clothes, listening to music about being pushed to the edge. All of it seemed like friendly conversation, mundane details that didn't matter, until suddenly they did. Because he hadn't asked the question yet that made all of it relevant, the question that would connect the timeline to the physical evidence, the question that would turn routine into confession. He was about to. The detective's gaze dropped to Tanaya's hands, resting on the table between them, and he leaned forward slightly. "I noticed that you have a small cut on your hand." Tanaya looked down at her own hands. The cut was small, barely visible, the kind of minor injury you might get from anything a kitchen mishap, a hangnail, a scratch. But the detective was looking at it like it mattered. "That looks like it could be from a knife." His tone had shifted. Still gentle, still conversational, but sharper now, pointed. "How did that happen?" Tanaya hesitated. For hours, she'd controlled this interrogation, asked about cameras, parsed Miranda rights, performed composure. But this was different. This wasn't a question about her story. This was a question about evidence. The detective continued, voice still calm but relentless. "We have a small knife that we recovered from the scene. From the classroom where Danyna had bled out in front of 30 witnesses. We think it has some DNA on it. Blood. Danyna's blood." And now he was looking at the cut on Tanaya's hand, and she could see him making the connection in real time. Her DNA. On the knife. The cut on her hand, matching the weapon that killed her classmate. "Do you sometimes carry a knife?" "No. I don't even carry pepper spray." The denial came automatically. But it sounded hollow even as she said it, because the evidence was right there on her hand, visible under the fluorescent lights of the interrogation room. "So how did your hand get cut?" Bodies tell truth when words lie. A small cut on a hand speaks louder than hours of careful deflection. DNA evidence doesn't care about your story, and skin holds confessions that mouths refuse to make. The knife has to match up with something. The detective's voice was steady, patient. He already knew. The forensics would prove it. Her DNA on the handle, Danyna's blood on the blade, the small cut on Tanaya's hand, explaining exactly how both ended up on the same weapon. For the first time since entering the interrogation room, Tanaya's calculated composure fractured. This wasn't a question she could deflect with a story or a performance. This wasn't about what she said or how she framed it. Her own body had already given the answer. The cut on her hand matched the DNA on the knife that killed Danyna Gibson. All the careful composure, the strategic questions about cameras, the precise parsing of Miranda rights, the performed calm when talking to Evan, the tears about lost love, none of it mattered when her own flesh told a story she couldn't talk her way around. The knife recovered at the scene had Danyna Gibson's blood on it, and the small cut on Tanaya Lewis's hand told investigators exactly how that blood got there. Her body had confessed what her mouth was still trying to deny. The breakthrough wasn't coming, it had already arrived. Now the detective needed to hear her say where the knife came from. The detective's voice was direct now, no more gentle questions about dogs and breakfast. Where did the knife come from? Tanaya was silent for a moment. The cut on...
Danyna was a straight-A student, someone who many others looked up to. She dreamt of one day working in computer engineering or robotics, and was doing everything in her power to make that happen.
That's at another part. But he needed to hear her say it where she got it. When she took it. What she was planning when she walked out her front door that morning. "Did you bring it from home?" She nodded. "When did you take it?" And then Tanaya began to describe that morning. And her voice was almost matter-of-fact. The same flat tone she'd used to talk about her dog, about choosing clothes, about listening to music on repeat, as if she were describing any other Wednesday. "After my dog went in the house to eat, I got dressed." The detective listened. "I went to the kitchen. Her family was downstairs. The house was waking up. A normal morning in every way except one. I took a small knife, and I walked out the door. Just like that. Took a knife. Walked out. past her family, through the front door, into her car or onto the sidewalk, headed towards school, with a weapon in her possession and a plan in her mind. What does the knife look like? It's black, small, from the kitchen. Evil doesn't always sound like rage or madness. Sometimes it sounds like a teenager describing her morning routine, listing mundane tasks in the same flat voice, walked the dog, chose an outfit, took a knife from the kitchen drawer, went to school. The detective asked more questions, building the timeline. After she dressed, after the dog ate, before anyone else in her house would notice a kitchen knife was missing. She described taking a murder weapon from her own kitchen with the same casual tone she'd used to describe feeding her dog. The horror wasn't in dramatics or emotion, it was in how ordinary she made it sound. Like any other item on a morning checklist. Get dressed, feed dog, take knife, go to school. Premeditation doesn't always announce itself with dramatic planning or elaborate schemes. Sometimes it's just a 17-year-old girl walking through her kitchen, opening a drawer, choosing a weapon, and walking out the door like she's grabbing her backpack. Tanaya Lewis had walked out of her house that morning with a small black knife from the kitchen. She'd carried it through the school hallways, sat with it in her backpack through first period. The weapon just feet away from classmates who had no idea what was coming. And then, in second period, she'd taken it out and driven it into Danyna Gibson's back. Premeditation wasn't a theory anymore. It was a confession. She described it in her own words, with her own voice, in the same ordinary tone she used to talk about routine. The decision hadn't been made in a moment of rage in the classroom. It had been made the night before, crystallized in the morning, and executed when Danyna walked through the door. But the detective needed to understand what happened in that classroom, what Danyna's last moments looked like through the eyes of her killer. The detective leaned forward, voice quiet. Tell me what happened in the classroom. What were you feeling when you took the knife out? The question was gentle, but it was asking for something terrible, a window into the moment before murder. What was going through Tanaya's mind when she reached into her bag? What she felt when her hand closed around the handle? What was happening inside her, in the seconds before she stood up and attacked? What were you feeling in the classroom? Tanaya paused. For the first time in the interrogation, her voice seemed to pull away, become more distant. I couldn't feel anything. The darkness she'd described the night before the rage, so deep it stopped feeling like rage, was still there that morning, still in second period, surrounded by classmates, listening to Miss Sonnenfeld start the lesson. Everything was dark. She tried to listen, tried to focus on the assignment, but everything was blurred, disconnected. She couldn't feel her body, couldn't hear the voices around her clearly, like watching the classroom from somewhere else, somewhere removed. What was going through your mind? I looked at her desk, Danyna's desk, 3 seats away. The girl who had told Evan the truth about Tanaya's infidelity. The girl who had warned Tanaya the night before to stop, to leave Evan alone, to back away from the edge. Tell me what happened. The detective kept his voice steady, professional. But inside his head, something shifted. There's a moment in every interrogation where the detective stops being an investigator and becomes a witness, where the paperwork transforms into a person who suffered, where the case file becomes a 16-year-old girl who will never finish high school. And you can't unhear what comes next. He'd heard confessions before, processed evidence, written reports, testified in court, but this hearing a 17-year-old describe the moments before she killed a classmate, the darkness and emptiness that preceded violence. This was where cases stopped being paperwork and became human tragedy. Tanaya's description was fragmented, distant, like she was watching herself from outside her own body. The dissociation gave her words an eerie flatness. The same tone she'd used to describe feeding her dog or taking a knife from the kitchen. She described looking at Danyna's desk, feeling nothing, seeing everything through a dark filter that made it all seem unreal. But she hadn't gotten to the moment itself yet, hadn't described taking the knife out, hadn't described standing up, crossing those 3 seats, driving the blade into Danyna's back, hadn't described what she saw in Danyna's eyes when her former best friend turned and realized what was happening. That was coming next. And the detective knew. Once she said it, he would carry those words with him for the rest of his career. Some confessions stay in your head long after the case closes. Some descriptions of violence become permanent residents in the space where you used to sleep without nightmares. He asked her to continue. Tanaya continued. Her voice went quiet, almost distant. She looked at me, and her eyes were so big. The moment after the first strike, Danyna turning, understanding in an instant what was happening to her. She was scared, eyes wide, terrified. A 16-year-old girl realizing she was being killed by someone she once called friend. I could see it in her face. The detective listened. There was nothing to say, no question to ask, just the terrible weight of hearing a murder victim's final seconds described by the person who took them. Tanaya kept talking, the words coming in fragments, disconnected. She ran. She ran towards the door, trying to escape, trying to survive, running for the classroom door while blood spread across her back, while her former best friend chased her with a knife, while 30 students watched, frozen in horror. And then she turned around and looked at me again, a second time. After the running, after the desperate attempt to reach the door, Danyna had turned back and looked at Tanaya again. What was in those eyes the second time? Still fear? Or something else? Hope for mercy that would never come? I just wanted to watch. The chase was not long. There was nowhere to go. Ms. Sonnenfeld would separate them soon, but the damage was already done. The wounds were already there. There are moments you witness that change you permanently, not because you were there when they happened, but because someone described them to you in such detail that you might as well have been. And now you carry a 16-year-old girl's terrified eyes in your memory,
I didn't want to get hurt. I didn't know.
even though you never met her, never knew her. But you know exactly how wide her eyes got when she understood she was dying. The detective sat with the weight of it. Danyna Gibson's final seconds of life described by the person who took them. Up until this moment in Tanaya's retelling, the victim had been her and she, an unnamed presence. But now, sitting in that interrogation room, hearing about those terrified eyes and that futile run toward the door, Danyna stopped being abstract. She became real. A 16-year-old with dreams of computer engineering and robotics. A straight-A student who looked up to by her classmates. Someone who had tried to do the right thing by telling Evan the truth. Someone who had warned Tanaya to stop, to back away from the edge. Someone who looked at her killer twice in her final seconds. First in shock, then in desperate hope for escape that would never come. The detective would carry that image for the rest of his life. Those eyes, described as so big, the fear visible in her face, the running toward a door she would never reach, the turning back to look one more time. He would carry it in the space where he used to sleep without nightmares. But the interrogation was not quite over yet. The question hung in the air between them like smoke. Do you want a lawyer? Tanaya sat motionless. Her hands were still folded on the table. Her face had gone slack, emptied of everything the confession had poured out. Detective Sergeant Kulke watched her across 3 feet of institutional space and waited. He had asked the question because Michigan law required it. He had asked because the confession was complete. He had asked because there was nothing left to excavate from this girl except silence. She blinked once, twice. Her gaze drifted to the corner of the room where the camera lens caught everything, then back to the detective. Her lips parted. Yes. One word. Flat. Final. Okay, Kulke said. He nodded once. Interview is concluded at 11:47 a.m. He reached forward and pressed the button that stopped the recording. The red light blinked off. The room fell into a different kind of quiet, not the silence of waiting for an answer, but the silence of a door closing. Tanaya did not move. She sat with her hands on the table and her eyes on nothing. Kulke stood, gathered his notepad, and stepped toward the door. He paused with his hand on the frame. "Someone will be in to take you back," he said. She did not respond. He left. The girl who had described her best friend's terrified eyes now sat alone in interview room B. The fluorescent lights hummed their steady electric drone. The table was bolted to the floor. The chair had no cushion. The walls were institutional beige. Everything in this room was designed to contain and observe. And Tanaya Lewis, 17 years old, sat at the center of it with the weight of her own words pressing down on her shoulders like hands. She had told them what happened. She had described the knife and the screaming and the blood. She had said Danyna's eyes were so big. She had said she was scared. And now the telling was over. What separates confession from consequence is only time. The gap between speaking the truth and living inside it can be measured in minutes, hours, days. For Tanaya, sitting alone in that room, the gap was shrinking. The words she had given the detective could not be taken back. They were recorded, documented, preserved. They would follow her into courtrooms and sentencing hearings and every official record of what she had done. The confession was not an ending. It was a door she had opened herself. 10 minutes later, a uniformed officer arrived to escort her back to her cell. She stood when he told her to stand. She walked when he told her to walk. She did not speak. The hallway was long and bright and empty. Her footsteps echoed against linoleum. Somewhere in this building, Detective Kulke was typing his report. Somewhere beyond these walls, Danyna Gibson's mother was planning a funeral. Somewhere in a classroom at Cass Tech, students were sitting at desks that would never be filled the same way again. Tanaya walked back to her cell and sat on the thin mattress and stared at the wall. The confession was over. The waiting had just begun. The waiting lasted months. Then came the trial. Then came the day when Tanaya Lewis stood in a courtroom and heard the law speak her future aloud. The judge asked Tanaya to stand. She rose from the defense table without sound. Her hands hung at her sides. The courtroom was full but quiet family in the gallery. Reporters in the back rows, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. The judge presiding over the case sat elevated. Robes dark against the wood paneling, the face of the law. He looked down at the papers in front of him, then lifted his gaze. "We find the defendant guilty of first-degree murder." The words landed like stones. Tanaya did not flinch. Her expression remained flat, emptied of whatever she had carried into this room. No tears, no reaction. She stood in the place where the law measures consequence, and she absorbed the verdict in silence. Danyna's mother sat 3 rows back. Her hands were folded in her lap. She did not cry either. She had already done that. What remained now was the listening, the hearing of official words that would never bring her daughter back, but would at least name what had been taken. The courtroom absorbed the verdict in a silence so complete that the sound of the judge's pen against paper was audible. He set the pen down. He looked at Tanaya again. 27 to 60 years in the Michigan Department of Corrections. 27 years minimum before parole eligibility. 60 years maximum. The numbers hung in the air like weights. Tanaya would be 44 years old at the earliest possible release. She might be 77. The math was unforgiving. Someone in the gallery, maybe Danyna's mother, maybe someone else who loved her, did different math. 27 years from now, Danyna would have been 43. She would have graduated high school, gone to college, built a career, maybe married, maybe had children of her own. She would have had a whole life. What does justice look like when the person you lost will never walk back through the door? The judge's gavel struck the bench once. The sound was sharp and final. Tanaya was led away by the bailiff. The courtroom began to empty. Danyna's mother stood slowly, her hands still folded, and walked out into the hallway where the light was too bright and the air too ordinary for what had just been spoken. The verdict gave a number. It gave years and boundaries and the promise of consequence. But it returned nothing. Danyna Gibson was still gone. Her desk at Cass Technical High School was still empty. Her voice was still silent. The law had spoken and the accounting was done, but the loss remained untouched. The gavel came down. The sentence was real. But in the hallways of the high school where both girls once walked, the question wasn't about years in prison. It was about what a classroom carries when one desk stays empty forever. The high school hallways looked the same as they always had, but everything had changed. Students walked the same routes between classes. Lockers slammed shut with the same metallic echo. The bell rang at the same times. But now, when they passed the tech building, some looked away, others looked in. The classroom where Danyna Gibson had collapsed was still used for classes. The desks were arranged the same way. The whiteboard still held notes from whatever lesson came next, but everyone knew which desk had been hers. No one sat there anymore. It stayed empty. A space that held nothing but absence. Students walked past the doorway and carried the knowledge with them. This was the room. This was where it happened. This was where a girl had bled out on industrial carpet while her classmates screamed for help. The building did not change. The walls did not memorialize. The floor had been cleaned, but the space itself had been rewritten. Some students took different routes to avoid passing it. Some walked faster when they had to. A few stopped in the doorway and stared, as if looking long enough might help them understand. It never did. Nearly 30 students had been in that room when Tanaya Lewis pulled the knife. 30 witnesses who saw Danyna collapse, who saw the blood spreading, who heard the sounds a body makes when it is dying. They had given statements to police. They had testified or prepared to testify. They had sat in counseling sessions and been told they would heal. But no amount of counseling can erase what the eyes have seen. They were teenagers. Most of them had never witnessed violence up close, not real violence, where the girl who falls does not get back up and the blood does not wash away between scenes. This had been real. The screaming had been real. 30 students had been in the room when it happened. All of them would carry it. A classroom is supposed to be safe. The one place violence should never reach. Children sit at desks and learn algebra, history, the mechanics of how the world works. They are supposed to be protected there. But safety is a promise, and promises can be broken with a single blade. They remembered exactly where they sat, exactly what they heard, exactly how long it took for the teacher to react, for someone to call for help, for the room to fill with the kind of silence that follows catastrophe. Those details were not fading. Time was not softening them. The brain holds on to terror with a grip that does not loosen. The verdict had closed the case. The legal system had done what it was designed to do. But for the students who had been in that classroom, the case was not closed. It replayed every time they walked past the tech building, every time they heard a sudden noise, every time they sat in a classroom and wondered if they were safe. They would carry this for the rest of their lives. The knife was gone. The sentence was passed. But the space where Danyna should have been at graduation, at prom, in the yearbook photo would stay empty. Some losses don't end when the gavel falls. Danyna Gibson was 16 years old. She would never be 17. She would never walk across a graduation stage. She would never choose a college major or start a career. She would never marry or have children or grow old. All of those futures ended on a February afternoon in a classroom at Cass Technical High School. Her mother still wakes up every morning knowing this. The empty chair at the dinner table. The bedroom that stays untouched. The phone that will never ring with her daughter's voice on the other end. Every birthday that doesn't come. Every graduation photo that will never be taken. Every grandchild who will never exist. The future Danyna should have had stretches out in front of her mother like a road that simply ends. 27 years from now, the earliest Tanaya Lewis might walk free. Danyna would have been 43. She would have lived an entire adult life, but she will always be 16. Frozen at the age when someone decided her truth was worth killing for. The verdict answered the legal question. Tanaya Lewis was guilty. The sentence was 27 to 60 years. But the verdict could not answer why. Why jealousy turned into a knife in a backpack. Why a friendship ended in blood on a classroom floor. Why 30 students had to see what no teenager should ever witness. Some questions don't have answers that satisfy. The law can establish guilt. It can measure consequence in years and prison walls. But it cannot explain the exact moment when rage becomes murder. It cannot quantify what makes one person capable of ending a life while another cannot imagine it. And at the center is a bitter irony that cuts deeper than any blade. Tanaya Lewis and Evan had been together. The betrayal Danyna confronted her about was real. Tanaya had been with her friend's boyfriend. Danyna had found out. Danyna had told the truth. How much does the truth cost when someone cannot bear to hear it? For Danyna Gibson, it cost everything. She spoke honestly about a betrayal that actually happened. And the person who betrayed her decided that honesty was unforgivable. The murder was not about a lie. It was about a truth Tanaya couldn't bear spoken aloud. So she silenced it. Permanently. The knife came out in a classroom. The attack was swift. Danyna ran toward the door. Turned back one last time, with eyes so wide they would haunt a detective forever. And then she fell. 30 students screamed. The teacher called for help. And Tanaya stood there, holding the blade, having just murdered the one person who refused to pretend the betrayal never happened. 27 to 60 years is the price of jealousy that cannot bear witness. The desk stays empty. The future stays stolen. And the truth that killed her remains. Danyna Gibson told the truth and died for it. That is what was taken. That is what will never return. A girl who was honest when honesty cost her life.
She looked at me, her eyes were so big, she was scared.
A 16-year-old who believed friendship and truth mattered. A student who walked into a classroom one February afternoon and never walked out. The gavel has fallen. The sentence is real. But the absence is permanent. This story stays with you because it shouldn't have happened. A 16-year-old girl lost her life for speaking the truth. Danyna Gibson's name deserves to be remembered. Not just as a victim, but as a person who valued honesty and friendship. She walked into a classroom one February afternoon and never came home. Her mother still carries the weight of that empty chair. The 30 students who witnessed it carry trauma that no verdict can erase. This case reminds us that violence can erupt in the places we're supposed to be safest, and that some truths cost more than they should. The lesson here is stark jealousy left unchecked can become deadly. Truth-telling should never be punished with violence, and the consequences of one person's rage ripple outward, touching families, classmates, teachers, and entire communities. Danyna's stolen future is a reminder that every life matters, and every loss leaves a permanent absence. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps me continue telling stories that matter. Drop a comment and let me know your thoughts. I read every one. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, feel free to share it. Thank you for listening with respect and empathy. This story is based on a real case. The 2018 murder of Danyna Gibson at Cass Technical High School in Detroit, Michigan. Some scenes have been dramatized for storytelling, but the names, dates, and events are real. My deepest respect goes to Danyna's family and all those affected by this tragedy. May her memory endure, and may her story remind us of the value of truth and the cost of violence.